I'm Natalia Lobach, and this is Change Course. The Signs of Power. One of the other great things I got caught up on over the summer is another podcast I listened to, Revisionist History by Malcolm Gladwell. Malcolm also has a newsletter or a dispatch. I'm not really sure. Bulletin. Not really sure how some of these things are done these days, but it's a bulletin. It is entitled OMG, which stands for O Malcolm Gladwell, which is a collection of various musings on different subjects. And so I caught up on both the podcast, so I'm up to date. It's a fascinating podcast. And I also caught up on the newsletter. And one of the things that was an idea that was linked through some of the other thinking I've been doing and the podcasts of the last couple weeks is, what are the signs that somebody has power? And how do you figure this out in an organization? So when I talk about connected change, power is an important element, and power is an element, power and influence together is an element that you need to evaluate and take stock of when you enter an organization or you're looking at starting to plan or conceptualize a change. And the reason is because power has such a long shadow in the organization. In my last couple episodes, I talk about the relationship between power and culture. I talk about the relationship and the ability of people in power to drive change through using tools like status and affiliation, how to use power for good. And what's interesting is that independently, this other piece of the various, catching up I've been doing started to talk about this idea of power distance and status markers and how these things are related. So when you're going into an organization and you're looking at evaluating power and influence from a connected change perspective, this is an interesting way to do it. So power distance. That's how much social distance is there between somebody who has power and somebody who doesn't. I see this all the time in organizations, and it's one of the ways that I evaluate who has power and who doesn't. So, power distance as a tool is a really interesting thing to evaluate. Government organizations, high power distance. Why? You can see it evidenced by, one, there are gatekeepers around people in power. So gatekeepers, meaning either you've got a team of people or you've got an assistant who is managing access to that person in power. Gatekeepers, very important. You see this repeated in other organizations as well. Who has an assistant? Who does not? And people who don't have some of those trappings of power in the organization will use access to themselves to create more power distance. One great example that I have that I call back to often was an organization that I was working in that had, an expectation of low power distance in terms of interaction, but a high expectation of power distance in terms of work and product. Is a very strange dynamic to navigate, and really interesting in how this played out. So there was a leader that I was working with that had an assistant. So there was a gatekeeper around formal access to that leader. But there was this design in the organization that you could really walk around the floor. This was back in the day when we were working in person. So different today. But this expectation that you could walk around the floor and really talk to anyone. And so this idea that every door was open, there was an open door policy. Well, how do you manage an open door policy if you're someone who wants to cultivate a high power distance? Well, you leave your door open, but you're never in your office. I think back to that often, and it's one of the most hilarious examples that I have of this. Open door policy, but never in your office. Great way to cultivate a high power distance between those, that you are yourself and those that you're leading. So when you see organizations that have a low power distance, this is where you can have a hierarchy with low power distance. You can also have flat organizations with low power distance. Typically, those two things go together. But you'll see people having access to or talking to the leader all the time. You also see physical markers of this. So leadership sitting in a collective workspace instead of having their own office. Leadership having, who has an office, right? Who doesn't have an office? Are leaders on a certain floor of the organization? Are leaders sitting with their team? Or if somebody prefers to lead with high power distance in a low power distance organization, how do they create that separation between themselves and the people that they're leading? Very interesting. And how I go in and evaluate how power works in an organization. The other thing is power distance is often invisible. And power distance is also communicated through status markers. So the markers of status really create that underlying power dynamic. It tells people without overtly telling people that you have power. It's like when you walk into a senior executive's office and it's the biggest office, and, it has a table and a couch and, a big desk and a big imposing sort of presence within that office. That tells you implicitly that this person has power. If you have to walk a long distance from the door to the desk, oh boy, that's a big power, that's a big status symbol, right? So you can sometimes see this in organizations, but status markers also show up in our culture. And I've linked something, there's a resource that I often use, and status markers are often interesting signs as well when we're looking at things like diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, which also is an important part of change, because when you're implementing change, those who have less privilege, less status in an organization, and sometimes privilege and status they go closely together. When you are someone in the organization who has less privilege, you are often more negatively impacted by the change. This is something that is really important that change leaders and leadership writ large needs to understand as we move into this, brave new world of, rapidly changing workplaces and a desire to bring about more diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging that really needs to be there in our society and in our workplaces. What I love about the wheel of power and privilege is that it identifies the central power locus and then identifies the different rings of relative power and privilege that exist in our society today. This one is a great resource because it is, well, first of all, I need to be very clear that it is focused on North American, and potentially this one is fairly aligned with Canadian culture. So this isn't something that you could take and apply to a different culture or a different society without changing some of these things that are in here. I need to be very clear about that, but it's a really interesting way to understand how that overarching societal structure impacts what's happening inside our organizations as well. So if we're looking at this, and I highly recommend that you click on the link, look at the tool. It's really, really interesting. And then also look at the graphic, because in a very succinct picture, it tells you exactly what it is that we're talking about. And it helps those who are closer to the center of power and privilege understand what is potentially being experienced by those who are further out in those concentric rings. So this, again, really helps to align this idea of status markers, because power and privilege and status markers all go together. So as I'm looking at the wheel and I'm looking at that center ring, those who are closest to power are those who are potentially, or, as it says in here, the people who are closest to power are white in Canadian culture. They are a Canadian citizen. They're typically a settler relative to a settler from a colonizing country, relative to those who are First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. They are able-bodied, with respect to people who have disabilities. They are cisgender. They are male. They have housing. They're housed. They are heterosexual, and they have affiliation with a dominant religion. So when we're looking at that, that's really what that locus of power and privilege looks like. And if you look at who has power and who holds power in Canadian society and in Canadian institutions, they very much look like that center ring. So those are status markers. Your race is a status marker. Your citizenship is a status marker. Your gender is a status marker, your sexual orientation, et cetera, et cetera. But these are implicit and, somewhat visible things, but also somewhat invisible in the way that they are applied and reacted and responded to. This is a fascinating tool, and I highly recommend that you spend some time with it. I use this often when I'm talking about power, or I'm looking at power within the organization. I'd be interested to know from people who are from other countries, other cultures, what your wheel of power and privilege might look like, and what changes you might make on here. Something else that I might make, a change that I might make in terms of organizational power and privilege. So power and privilege within large organizations here in Canada would be your education. And there's also some class status that comes into play here as well, which again is very difficult to discern and to sort of pick apart. So those are some of the things that I might change in here. Certainly education status, but also which school you went to is somewhat important in Canada. So I'll leave you to think a little bit more about that. Going back to how I got here in the first place, Malcolm Gladwell was talking about some of the status markers and power distance that he observed. And this is kind of close to my heart, and I do need to talk a little bit about this. So Malcolm is from Elmira, which is a small town in southwestern Ontario. And Elmira is an area that has a high population of Mennonites. And Malcolm often talks about Mennonite society and his observations of Mennonite culture. And I find this very interesting because that is how I grew up. So my background is not going to be a subject of this podcast, but I do have Mennonite heritage, and I grew up in a Mennonite culture. in a big city. So very different to what people might expect. But the cultural aspects of being Mennonite are very pervasive. Even if you are growing up in a diverse city like Toronto, even if you're growing up away from, and not part of the dominant cultural centers, there's still some very interesting and strong threads that run through this culture. And it is different than the dominant Canadian culture. And Malcolm talked about his experience at a wedding where he went to this wedding celebration in his hometown of Elmira, and it was a Mennonite wedding, and that, there was a low power distance and an absence of what were, typically expected status markers at a wedding. And I thought this was a very interesting observation. So, for example, you would think at a typical wedding, or, some weddings and cultures are, weddings are used to show the status of the family. Typically, you'll have a display of hospitality that might be linked with a display of wealth around hosting your guests. So what kind of reception do you have? How did the bride and groom arrive? What are they wearing? Where is the bride's dress from? How much did it cost? What are the decorations? Who was the florist? What type of catering do you have? All of these things, start to show some of these invisible status markers that we have in North American society. Things like, what kind of car do you drive? What neighborhood do you live in? How big is your house? Where did you go on vacation this year? These are all examples of status markers. Is your watch a Swatch or a Rolex? I mean, come on, we're human. We use status markers all the time in whatever group that we're in to try and show either affiliation or power within that group. It's just another way that we do it. So Malcolm's observation was very interesting, and it prompted a response from another person of the Mennonite community talking about, well, actually, you know what? There are some very specific status markers in Mennonite communities that are different than the status markers of modern day North American society. And I found this fascinating. So while Gladwell talks about his experience at the wedding where the bride and groom served homemade food to their guests, and the wedding was located on a rural property and people brought lawn chairs, and there was an abandonment by this society of status markers. Well, the person who provided the rebuttal actually talked about and did an amazing job of explaining the status markers that exist within this particular society. And so the point that I want to make here is that you can never be free of status markers. Every community, every organization, and every group of people organized around something have status markers. And status markers, again, are linked with power and linked with affiliation. Power distance is something different, again. Also fascinating. But if you're a leader coming into an organization and you need to have power and influence and status in order to make your change happen, which, by the way, you do need it. What's going to matter more is not what you think is important in terms of status markers, but what the group thinks is important. And so in some ways, leaders, you're going to be challenged to react, respond, and also work around whatever the status markers are of the community or the organization that you are in. So I'll provide a very specific example, from the rebuttal that one of the Mennonites wrote to Malcolm Gladwell's post. This person talks about using a specific cookbook for preparing meals or for, your everyday life. And I would actually say that is close, but not quite true. The cookbook aside, it's more about how you prepare food and what you do. So in Mennonite communities or Mennonite societies, there is a strong preference or status around women specifically, not men, because this is a very patriarchal society. So not men, women specifically, who cook and bake and do food preparation entirely from scratch. So for example, now this is where, as somebody who grew up inside one culture and then also, is finding herself within a dominant North American culture, it's really interesting to see these cultural conflicts. So, for example, a Mennonite friend of mine told me a story where she was invited to a family event. And typically in these events, it is culturally appropriate to ask everyone to bring food in order to contribute to the gathering. And that's something that happens all the time. It's actually an expectation of the culture that that's what you do. So food is never purchased. Food is always made by those who are attending and brought together in a spirit of communion. Very nice, right? Like really great in terms of, inclusion. But I do have to mention that it's only the women who do it. And also, there are some very strict boundaries around what is acceptable and what is not. So my friend showed up to this event and brought a bean salad that she had made herself. And so the question that she got was, well, did you use canned beans or did you rehydrate and cook the beans from scratch? I will be honest with you. The only acceptable culture the only acceptable answer in Mennonite culture is, I rehydrated the beans, cooked them, and used them from scratch. Canned beans are not acceptable, which in dominant North American culture is kind of hilarious, right? So, for example, if I was showing up to someone's house in dominant North American culture and was asked to bring a salad, the fact that I had made the salad myself or I had made something myself is seen as really exceptional or really a treat. And, it's a very different way of looking at things. So status markers, whether they are visible or invisible. So, specifically in this culture, what's described here is status markers that are around what you do or how you act. Or, some of these things around your heritage or your upbringing are also important, which are not in your control, but are part of the status markers in a Mennonite community. Then you have your dominant North American culture, which also has very interesting status markers in terms of just the base of the culture. But then you also have status markers like wealth and privilege and status markers within every group that you might be a part of. So, as I was saying, really important as you're going into an organization, what are those status markers that are important? And if you're going to be leading change, make sure that you're communicating your status and your power through the various markers that are meaningful in the community that you are a part of. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, I invite you to like, rate, share, and subscribe because it helps others find us. Our music is Levity by Emily Clausen. Change Course can be found wherever you get your podcasts, and we have an accessible version with fully edited captions on YouTube. You can find the link to this version on www.charthouse.ca in the Change Course podcast show notes. While you're visiting us, sign up for the Change Navigator newsletter. We're launching shortly, and you'll get a monthly dispatch of all things change and hear about the upcoming launch of connectedchange.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's never too late to change course.